legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat and my guest today is Luke Dodson. The decline of industrial civilization and a welter of political, economic, social and cultural ills is plain to see, even if most still deny it. But what's behind the wokification of history? The rise of populism in recent times has caused a crisis among so-called liberals and progressives who feel that the comfortable world they took credit for building is being eroded by racists, bigots and fascists. But if the underlying mythic structure of your worldview and ideology is based around the idea that future equals good and past equals bad, cognitive dissonance will result. Simply put, in a world that is not conforming to the narrative of continuous progress, the response from self-declared progressives has been to try to rewrite our past into the multicultural utopia that they wish to see realised. This will not end well. The war on reality cannot be won. Hello and welcome, Luke, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Thanks, Greg. It's always a pleasure.
Now, Luke, you and I met up recently for the first time in person in London at a launch events, book launch talk, call it what you will, for Jason Horsley's new book, Big Mother, The Technological Body of Evil, which is, I think it is most important work to date. Now, there's a lot of topics covered in there that you and I have share an interest in. I've said a little bit in my recorded introduction about what we'll be discussing today, and the title really of the talk should tell people a lot, if not everything they need to know. But before we really get started, just tell, for listeners who haven't come across you before, just tell them a little bit about your work.
I'm a blogger and podcaster. I've also got a background in music, and my field of study was in literature, so I'm very interested in how language shapes our perceptions of reality and how narratives are formed in the culture. One of my areas of interest is in history. I was a little bit obsessed with medieval history and Dark Age history when I was quite young, because I got interested in the old Celtic and Norse, Greek myths, and then I was interested in finding more out about the cultures that produced those and seeing that they had elements of wisdom that perhaps we've lost now, although they weren't utopias by any stretch of the imagination. And they had many aspects of their culture that contemporary people would find shocking. But nonetheless, I felt that there was something there that is interesting and worth knowing about. And so where I've been going recently with my writing and with my podcasting is talking about the way that our current narratives about history are changing and how they are reflecting aspects, that Jason talks about parapolitics and social engineering. So there's that aspect of it. There is clearly a lot of conscious manipulation of agendas at play, but I also think there's a lot of unconscious movements, in the biggest, most macro, most Jungian sense of that term, that there are things moving within the unconscious. And it's quite interesting to read the contemporary narratives as if they're you're an analyst in the chair in the therapy room, and a client is telling you their dreams and the things that they're dreaming about the culture, can be very revealing. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Well, the woke rewriting of history, from the title of our talk, really this culture has been about, the contemporary culture, air quotes around progressive, because it's not really what progressive meant in decades gone by, has generally been about forward movement, and all of these trends that woke culture exemplifies are positive, and old and unfashionable ideas are receding into the past, and that history is linear in terms of progress. Things were less good in the past, and they're becoming more good as we move forward. The only way is up. Now, that idea is going away on all sorts of fronts, not least, in people's everyday lives, and in terms of economics, politics, and social and cultural trends. But this relatively recent development that we're talking about here is this, amplifying the role of some of these, woke ideas or modern contemporary subcultures that really may or may not actually exist in any kind of tangible reality. That this somehow is something that existed in the past. For me, it's a really interesting development, because if these are all examples of things getting better, for the species, and progressive trends, and moving away from, dark age ideas, why this sort of need to rewrite history? Because to me, that just seems like, rather than proving your ideas, they're self-evident, that you somehow need to then point to a sort of overhauled or revised version of history to say that these things are positive, because they existed in the past. Because until recently, it was all about, as I say, the old non-fashionable ideas of the past. And now it's kind of like, oh, well, but the ideas that we're pushing, they're nothing new at all.
It's a really interesting development, because, as you say, the whole narrative of progress is, a linear upward trend. What seems to be happening now is that people, particularly in academia, are increasingly appealing to the authority of the past and of tradition to sort of shore up certain ideas. And one of the instances that I found particularly striking and very amusing was a study that came out in 2021, I think, that claimed that a Finnish grave, I think it was a knight or a warrior or some kind of early medieval grave they found, that the person that was interred in the grave may have been non-binary. And I just burst out laughing as soon as I read this, because the whole notion of it is completely insane. I mean, the word non-binary had no meaning in any context except possibly maybe certain aspects of computer coding, or I don't know. I don't know anything about computer programming, but I know there's binary code in computers. It had no meaning up until a few years ago. And so then to retrospectively label a grave as containing someone who is non-binary is just the most blatant display of kind of Orwellian propaganda, but of a really strange and petty sort. It's not, Eurasia has always been at war with East Asia or Oceania or whatever, which we're seeing plenty of that as well. But it's just, someone may have been a member of a subculture that didn't exist till about 2015 or so.
The whole non-binary idea is one in the mind. I'm not trying to belittle anyone's idea of, what they feel themselves to be, whatever their body is or however they feel, that doesn't represent the true them. But it's just a way of identifying how you feel about these things is a non-binary thing. There's nothing that you can identify by means of archaeology or forensic biology that you can say that someone is non-binary. It's purely just something that they declare themselves to be. And if they're sincere in that, well, knock yourself out. But it's a mental concept.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is the really striking thing about that particular study, which was that they're conflating several different ideas. So gender ideologues often conflate the medical biological condition that of hermaphroditism, or what is now called intersexed individuals. That is a biologically recognized category that applies to a very small number of people. And in fact, all intersex people are themselves either male or female. Sex is always binary, even for the intersexed people, that they might have genetic traits or physical traits that would be more in common with the opposite sex, but nonetheless, they're never a 50-50 mix. This is something that is really important, and people often don't recognize this, even people who really should know better about these things. So you've got intersex. So the idea was that this Finnish person may have been intersex, which is a really dicey thing to figure out from a grave. I mean, even a standard male or female identification for a skeleton of that age can be tricky. But when you're talking about very, very small signals in someone's biology that would indicate that they had this condition, that's very tricky to pick up from a grave. I want to bring in the work of my friend Stone Age Herbalist, who we talked about in the preamble, because he's a really interesting archaeologist. He's anonymous, and he's got a Substack. He's got a very active Twitter, and he writes a lot about this. At the moment, what's happening in archaeology, and this is a kind of a bit of a side tour, but we can touch on it because it does actually. It's very relevant to the overall topic that we're discussing today. Archaeology is kind of bifurcating into the nuts and bolts world of genetic archaeology or archaeogenetics, which is proving lots of old reactionary theories that were consigned to the dust from years past, such as, the expansion of the Indo-European tribes across Eurasia, all these kind of ideas that got a very bad reputation after the Second World War, being associated with racism, colonialism, imperialism, all that. They're all coming back due to the advances made in genetic research. What archaeologists have done in response to that is either gone along with the new research or come up with ideological ways to try to subvert it or undermine it. And you get this coming out as either saying that genetic research is actually not trustworthy because somehow it's intrinsically racist or colonialist or all these things. So you can't actually, epistemologically, you can't trust it because it's just not, the data is damned. It's cursed, You get others who try to do things like the Cheddam Man reconstruction, which happened around 2015, around the time of the whole kind of Brexit controversy and the rise of populism, which led a lot of comfortable intellectuals, educated people, ivory tower types to start quivering a little bit because suddenly the unwashed pitchfork waving MAGA hat wearing masses were surrounding the academy, or so they imagined, and so they came up with these sort of reconstructions of the Cheddar Man, who's I believe Mesolithic, very well preserved body found in Cheddar in Somerset. One of his descendants actually lived in Cheddar fairly recently, may even still live there today. Direct descendants, according to genetic research. They did a reconstruction where they made his skin look very much darker than he necessarily was. He probably did have dark skin, maybe darker than most contemporary British people today, who knows. we don't really know. There's no real reason to assume so. Certainly no reason to assume that he could be identified as being black, which again is another category that these terms like black and white, they come up after the sort of the colonial period. They don't really, there isn't really a strong precedent for those terms meaning the things that they mean now prior to, I'm just going to sort of off the top of my head say probably like the 1600s, maybe the 1500s. They came up as a result of the indentured servitude that was going on in the colonies, which included a lot of both black and white indentured servants, and a lot of Irish, a lot of English, a lot of all kinds of European nationalities ended up in this. The kind of the sort of the version of history that I was taught was that it was the terms black and white were really created as a way of dividing this indentured servant class, because they were they tended to align with each other in the revolts against their masters. So as a way of sort of divide and conquer strategy, these concepts like white and black, there may be a more complicated explanation than that, but that's certainly the version of history that I learnt. I'm sure there's some truth to that. But anyway, Cheddam Man lived a very long time before any of these categories had any meaning. And really, it was a kind of weaponization of archaeological research, I think, to sort of try to undermine what these liberal academics would call the far right, which at the time I thought this is a shaky move, because if it turns out that they're wrong, then they're not exactly going to look like they have a good position. They have a good leg to stand on.
Well, I mean, you could look at that period of history, the colonial period, as maybe one of the first major steps on the road to the world we find ourselves in now. I mean, of course, there was empire and millennia gone by before that, and large scale domination, exploitation, and control. But to the modern era, you could see that period as the early rumblings of what's actually beginning to show signs of straying and cracks in now. And speaking of black and white, I mean, and divide and conquer, I mean, that's one of the things that characterizes so much of our culture, and what passes for debate now is black and white, not in terms of race or skin color, but just in terms of you're either with us or against us, one side or the other. Lack of nuance, literally a lack of color. It's just one or the other. It's just very, very prevalent. It's like anybody trying to navigate a way between those things is, likely to get dashed on the rocks.
Yeah. Well, Jason introduced me to the concept of schismogenesis, which was something that Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist, wrote about. And schismogenesis is where it can happen organically when there's a tribal conflict or an ethnic conflict, and the two opposing groups amplify their differences in response to the conflict. But Bateson, I believe, was talking about it, and certainly Jason Horsley is talking about it in terms of a deliberate process by a faction outside of the conflict that is stoking the conflict. It's a way of trying to prevent people from sharing knowledge, sharing ideas, and pooling together their resources to come up with a more complete and more nuanced picture of what is. So I think that's happening a lot now, certainly. And as you say, that issues are so often black and white, or black or white, and that it's still ethnicity and race are being used and weaponized for that purpose. You know, you can see this on social media and Twitter. You know, you see the sort of the different ethnic factions and sort of political factions emerging, and you know, trying to fight for their corner. And you're seeing this a lot now with what's happening in the Middle East. You know, there's you know, one side calling for the destruction of the other side, and the same, you know, all over the place. It's very difficult to come up with a fairly nuanced picture when you're being invited and pulled into this sort of, well, you're either on this side and all those people are bastards and need to die, or you're on that side and all the other people are bastards, and you know, all this just complete hysteria, and you know, there is something of human nature in there that is like, whenever there's a conflict, you start to feel, you know, what's going to happen to my tribe? What's going to happen to my clan? We're programmed to feel that way, and those feelings are being weaponized quite a bit nowadays, and with some really quite potentially quite grotesque results, I think. You know, particularly with regards to sort of ethnic tensions. I think there's a lot that's being deliberately stoked up. Interestingly enough, actually, just as a side note, a BLM regional leader came out in support of the right-wing MAGA Proud Boys, and so there's, you know, that's an interesting turn up for the books, where I'm not of the view that either the BLM or the Proud Boys are anything but both media psyops themselves, but it's kind of interesting to see that one side being played off against the other, but then occasionally individuals within that going, hang on a minute, we actually potentially have more in common with each other than we have with the elites who are trying to play us off against each other. So it'd be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, it's like, you know, one of your bots has blown a gasket, you know, they're not supposed to behave like that.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't need anyone to tell us who our tribe is. You know, there's something that you should understand innately and feel. If you got someone who's apparently outside of your so-called tribe telling you this is your tribe, you need to identify with them, then you know that, you know, straight away that's not your tribe. We use that word loosely to refer to that natural, you know, human propensity going back into the earliest history of the group of people that you grew up around, you know, your family and your extended family and other people who are like you. This is a very natural human instinct, you know, programmed. Even today, you know, we tend to, in just going through life, you know, tend to like people who are like us. No, usually subconsciously or unconsciously, you know, it's just a thing. We like people who like us, and we like people who are like us. Doesn't mean we don't like people who are not like us, but you know, you're just naturally drawn. That's the way this thing works, and that probably has roots, as I say, genetic or psychological, unconscious roots going back to the earliest times. But then to be all of this, like we referred earlier to black and white, the divide and conquer, the creation of ever more groups and subgroups. It's Steiner's idea of, I see it, you know, his phrase, the war of all against all. That's what it feels like at the minute, you know, more and more subdivision and subdivision, you know, getting to the point where it's just absurd trying to keep track of it. But going back to what you were saying about the recent populist trends characterized with the Brexit vote, the UK voting to leave the European Union, again, flying in the face of what the establishment wanted. They apparently didn't see that coming, but some of us sitting on the sidelines could have said, you're playing with fire here. This is Russian roulette. You get a 1 in 6 chance of blowing your brains out. Also, the election of Trump, similar idea. There's no way this lunatic is ever going to win the election, and he did. And you mentioned Francis Fukuyama. We both have, you know, the whole sort of end of history and the narrative of continuous progress. In response to this rewriting of the past that we're talking about here, or attempt to do so, for me, it really seems so incredibly futile. A bit like that whole Finnish grave, archaeology. It's really hard to see what this could achieve. I mean, what's the actual point? I mean, is it as futile as I think it is? Do you see it that way? I mentioned to you again in the preamble off air. So what if there were like apparently thousands of people, trans people in the Napoleonic Wars, or if during the Ice Age there were X number of intersex people? So what? What it seems to me like a real exercise in futility.
Interesting question, because I don't know if I hang out with enough people who would so unthinkingly consume this kind of propaganda to say how well it's working on people. It certainly does seem to be the case that more and more you get these sort of films and television programs that are depicting, say, medieval European history or more recent history, and they'll cast an improbable ethnic actor in a role, and just nobody's allowed to sort of even comment on it. Hang on a minute, why are they playing a Viking? What is that? Surely that's not quite historically. And I mean, that I don't really care about historical accuracy in fiction, because it's like, well, is Laurence Olivier allowed to play Othello even though he's not North African? Well, sure, it's fine, within a certain context, but it's not a case of just, this is, we're a theatre company and we're just going to cast the best actors that we think for the role, and some of them happen to be this ethnicity, some of them happen to be that ethnicity. It doesn't really matter. It seems to be the fact that you're not allowed to say it. Like, hang on a minute, why is David Copperfield being portrayed by a young South Asian guy, when surely there were South Asian people in Victorian Britain? No question, probably quite a few, more than people imagine. That make a film about them. That'd be interesting. Why do you have to? It's this sort of like, it's this very strange kind of cognitive dissonance that I think that's the point, is to create a sense of just, hang on, everything's a bit dreamlike, everything's a bit sort of weird. You're not allowed to say it because people say, oh, that's you're skirting the edges, but it's not even like saying this is a bad thing. It's just saying, why is this now, and why now? And I think that, yes, I think that this fracturing that seems to have taken place with the rise of populism, what's behind that? I mean, that I think that a lot of these populist movements themselves are deeply embedded within the same matrix of financial and political relationships that they claim to be opposing. I don't believe that Nigel Farage is a great freedom fighter, particularly.
No, he's a finance guy. He's a businessman.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly comes from that. Well, nonetheless, I mean, you can make a case that he's a sort of an insider who's become a bit of an opportunist, who's kind of knows some tricks and he's trying to get his way within it. I don't know. I mean, I to be honest, I don't really care. I'm not that interested in in what he gets up to. But there does seem to be some power struggle going on at the moment within the elites. I think that there is an element of it that's just theatre, but I also do think there is a genuine. The stakes are quite high now, and people like Trump represent a certain faction that not necessarily any better than the ones that they're opposing, but they are a potential threat to some power interest. And so I think that there's a doubling down on all of those things that John Michael Greer very astutely recognized as being the qualities that our ruling classes like to imagine they have as the justification for them being on top. So he explains this in The King in Orange very well, which is that our sort of liberal managerial elites, they like to think of themselves as being the most enlightened, the least racist, the most tolerant, or the most inclusive, even though they're not really, they're just as bigoted as anyone else. But they like to imagine, they tell themselves and the rest of us that story. And so they're doubling down on these, increasingly insane woke ideas, like let's get a drag queen to wave some sex toys around in a school in front of little children, and they all go, yes, this is very good and very progressive, because that is their signaling to the rest of us that they are so much better, that they can see the enlightened wisdom in that. But yeah, I mean, going back to something else that we were talking about, which is that the fear that perhaps the future isn't all it's cracked up to be, and then maybe we have to look to the past for the justification for our narrative. In fact, it was always like this, there have always been Cheddam Man was not just black, he was non-binary or something like this. And all of these sorts of ideas that establishing a continuity rather than a linear upward progression now. Perhaps that's an indicator that the myth of progress is collapsing. I don't know. It'd be interesting, though.
Well, it's worth pointing out that we talk about, these elites being so-called, thinking themselves as tolerant. All tolerant really means is actually putting up with something you don't like. I hear this quite a lot. People saying, oh, we're such a tolerant society, or this institution is very tolerant, or, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, putting up with something that you dislike is, some kind of stoicism, but it's not really an acceptance of the validity or, value of that which you're tolerating. Sometimes we will tolerate the cold until our heating system is fixed, that type of thing. We will tolerate hunger until food arrives in the shops again, that type of thing. But it's interesting talking about this projection of current trends, onto the past along the lines that you've been talking about, because it's almost like, all of this diversity, again, in air quotes, that we're enjoying now, increasing diversity. I would just call it division more than anything else. We project it onto the past, but I really see it as disintegration beyond division, actually. So this disintegration of the culture that we're going through at the minute, projecting that onto the past. Now, turning the idea of the myth of progress, the narrative of progress, as seen by some people not as a myth, turning it on its head. Rather than saying, the past was whatever, great achievements there were, we're still, the only way is up. We're moving forward all the time. It might be a rocky road, but we keep moving up. Now what's being said, this, what's, unconsciously being said is that the disintegration that we're seeing now, that's presaged in the past. You see what I mean? So it's almost a strange way of saying, if it was said in bold terms, it would be, things are bad now, but the past was just as bad. So, how does that sound, set against the overarching idea of eternal progress?
Well, it sounds to me sometimes when I hear people telling themselves things like, the city they live in, it's just the same as it's always been, whatever it is. It can sound to me a bit like what the young kids on the internet are calling these days a cope, which is they've turned the verb cope into a noun. A noun? Yeah, I'm thinking I've got that right. It's been a long time since I studied English, guys. It's a bit rusty, but it's a cope is a noun, and what it means is it's a cope is a way of shoring off an unpleasant reality.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com